Hey, this is Geoffrey Woo from Human, and we're really excited to launch Human Ketone. And as a part of this launch campaign, we're hosting top academics in the field of ketosis and giving their own personal perspectives around their own personal research into ketones, as well as the development of the entire space. So I'm excited to have our first video perspective from Professor Dominic D'Agostino from USF, one of the premier researchers in ketosis today. So excited to have this conversation.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you've been a widely published and cited author in a number of papers on endogenous and exogenous ketosis. So I'm curious, in your experience, what was one or two of the most exciting moments that you've personally had in your research in exogenous ketones?
One or two, man, we've had a bunch. But I think the thing that's most memorable was the first time we took an exogenous ketone and we administered it acutely in a rat model and subjected that model to a very strong stimulus of oxygen, high oxygen, which typically evokes a seizure in about 5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
In a state of therapeutic ketosis, we could extend that 600%, and it happened from the very first animal that we studied, and every animal that we studied after that, we saw an extension. So I remember we were all kind of standing around the hyperbaric chamber and watching the neuroprotective effect of acute ketosis. I was under the impression that it had to be produced and sustained for a week or two, but we didn't actually have the money or the means to administer that amount in that amount of time. So that would be like number one, and I think the second observation that really got us excited was the observation that adding ketones to a standard diet, a high carbohydrate standard rat chow, extended the survival time and suppressed tumor growth in an animal model of metastatic cancer.
Wow.
So, and that all happened within a year or two when I first started studying this in about 2009 or 10. So they were very memorable moments in my ketone research.
Yeah. Oxygen toxicity and cancer are, especially cancer, is one of the most pernicious diseases affecting humans. And I think that is just one of a potential indication of ketosis or exogenous ketones. So I'm curious to zoom scope out a little bit here, and in the entire literature of ketosis, what do you think are some of the most promising directions moving forward?
Yeah, so it used to be the ketogenic diet specifically for pediatric epilepsy when I started studying this, and there really wasn't any other applications for nutritional ketosis.
Maybe obesity.
Maybe obesity.
Yeah.
Clinically accepted standard of care applications. So that's how I kind of define it.
Yeah.
But now it's expanding and blowing up to so many different applications. So I think one, and it may apply to many different disorders, is the effect of ketones. The ketone metabolite suppresses inflammation, specifically the NLRP3 inflammasome, which we know is kind of a hub, and when it's activated, it sets off an inflammatory cascade in the body that, if prevented or suppressed, could prevent the early initiation of age-related chronic diseases. We know that cancer, one of the hallmarks of cancer is inflammation. So chronic inflammation causes genomic instability that can kick on oncogenes and cause cancer. We know that things, like Alzheimer's disease and even epilepsy, many forms of neurological diseases, are a result of chronic neuroinflammation, whether it be caused by an environmental factor or a virus or just amyloid plaques and things like that. So I think the observation that a endogenous metabolite is working as a signaling molecule independent of metabolism, as a hormone, like a signaling molecule, and suppressing inflammation, I think that's very exciting. That we can do that through a number of different means, whether it be intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, or ketone supplementation, which would be the option for people who are unwilling or unable to implement a strict nutritional strategy to elevate that metabolite.
Yeah. I'm actually curious to dive into that point. So this is something that is just an active area of research. I don't think there's a definitive answer. How much of, or how broad, of the effects of a ketogenic diet or intermittent fasting, what subset of those indications or downstream effects do you think would you ascribe to just the ketones themselves?
That's a good question, and that's we seek to gain insight into that question based on some of the work that we're doing. I personally believe that a modified form of the ketogenic diet with ketone supplementation may be optimal for a number of disease pathologies, maybe performance, but that the jury's still out on that.
Right.
So I think undoubtedly there are some benefits that you get, like autophagy, with fasting, intermittent fasting, and there may be some benefits to the ketogenic diet, or that you get with a ketogenic diet that you may not get with exogenous ketones alone. But I do think that a wide range of neurological pathologies and things outside of the brain too that are responsive to ketogenic diet therapy will also be responsive to exogenous ketone therapy. There's many ones off the top of my head, but type 2 diabetes, for example. I mean, you have observed, we were talking about it, and I have observed that there's an acute and pretty good sustained suppression of blood glucose.
20-30%.
And insulin, and that's huge. I mean, considering that type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance is a huge problem, which is an underlying problem that, if not addressed, leads to early onset of chronic diseases, potentially Alzheimer's disease, definitely cancer too, is like many different types of cancers are linked to hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia. So just being able to mitigate that with a supplement, and we've done quite a bit of work with metformin, and I mean the exogenous ketones can blow away metformin when it comes to suppressing, reducing blood glucose levels and even reducing insulin levels.
Yeah, that's
so
like
that's like
good
super exciting to me.
Professor Tim Noakes coming and trying that and saying that, wow, compared to metformin, human ketone was able to suppress much more aggressively. It was interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, just think about the effects of the ketogenic diet or low carb, doesn't even have to be ketogenic diet, and its ability to put type 2 diabetes patients into remission in a relatively short amount of time. The work that Jeff Volek and Stephen Finney are doing with Virta is a pretty dramatic example of that. But if you have, there are some people I just know communicating with hundreds, if not thousands of people that are just unwilling or unable to do a ketogenic diet or even a low carb diet.
Right.
And we know from our work and me taking various supplements personally that, and watching other people take supplements too and looking at their blood work, that even if you're not on a carbohydrate-reduced diet, you get a significant benefit in reduction in glucose. And we don't know what that means long-term because we just don't have enough studies yet, but one can imagine that if you're pushing, biomarkers down, inflammation, insulin, lowering blood glucose, elevating ketones. I know my C-reactive protein's almost non-detectable now, or it was always kind of mid to upper elevated before I got onto the ketogenic diet. These things are going to pay big dividends, for our longevity. Yeah.
So, what are some of the biggest misconceptions with exogenous ketones that you've received questions about?
There's quite a few. I would say maybe the first one would be if you drink exogenous ketones, that it's a weight loss supplement. And I think it could inadvertently lead to weight loss, but consuming ketones in and of itself is not...
It's an extra energy source.
It's an extra energy source. So you don't, by virtue of the laws of thermodynamics, you typically can't put more energy into a system and expect, your body.
Right.
I do think that continuous consumption may improve metabolic health in a way that could enhance your fat oxidation capacity.
Right. Yeah. And also, I guess our research lead, Brianna, has a paper accepted into obesity. I think it actually will be published very, very shortly, showing that ketone ester drinks reduce ghrelin, the appetite hormone.
Yes.
So it might not directly lead to weight loss, but it may reduce appetite and therefore potentially overall reduce calorie consumption.
Exactly, and I think it makes insulin and ghrelin work better and can maybe normalize these, especially in people who have been eating a surplus amount of calories or a high carbohydrate diet. Yeah. And I think a lot of people are concerned about insulin too. I know there's kind of a misconception or some early data showing that IV infusion of ketones can increase insulin, or maybe when it's taken in a big bolus, you get a spike in insulin that could be, lipogenic, could make you store fat. But in the real world scenario, maybe even a little spike in insulin could be beneficial as far as enhancing metabolism in different ways. But what we see when we incorporate exogenous ketones, whether they be esters or ketone salts, into the diet, there's generally an enhancement of insulin sensitivity and a lowering of baseline insulin. So that's what's most important, I think, which could potentially lead to greater fat loss over time by enhancing insulin sensitivity. And then you also, in theory and even in practice, when you administer ketones, you see a decrease, and we talked about this, in blood glucose, suggesting that ketones are enhancing glucose disposal or maybe reducing hepatic gluconeogenesis, improving glycemia, which could be a significant therapeutic effect too, and maybe getting the tissues to use glucose in a better way. So some people are concerned about adding carbohydrates and ketones at the same time and producing potentially ketoacidosis. But the potential for that happening is not really a concern, because you would have to consume an amount that would really be self-limiting. Like you wouldn't be able to consume an amount that would put you into ketoacidosis.
I mean, I think the ranges that we expect with human ketone is between 3 to 5 millimole, and ketoacidosis is like 20 millimole.
Yeah, and you're just not going to feel well. And I think, I do think, I know personally, I kind of feel better in the lower range, around 2, maybe at the most 3. But after that, especially if I'm sedentary and just working at my desk, I think I have an advantage if I do have ketones in my system, but definitely no advantage, and maybe a disadvantage if levels start getting high, because it produces a mild metabolic acidosis that your body has to deal with. But if you're exercising, so that could be a different story, right? Because you're adding fuel to a system, and
you're already breathing
utilizing
out the acid. You're breathing heavier,
and you're disposing of it. And the body's compensatory, respiratory, and renal compensation can adjust for pH. It's a very small kind of impact on your body's acid-base balance during ketones. If you run up the stairs, that's a much bigger, your body has to do a lot more countermeasures to balance your acid levels from doing, simple anaerobic or high-intensity exercise.
Yeah. So Dom, with the launch of human ketone, it'll be the first time there will be a commercially available ketone ester drink that everyone can purchase and use. I know you've studied ketone esters in your research. What do you think the implications are going to be for athletes, for everyday folks that are trying to use ketone esters? What do you think that unlocks?
Well, I think it's an exciting experiment because we haven't studied these in the capacity. We know that they have effects on metabolism that have broad-ranging implications for a number of therapeutic diseases, and which I study mostly. And I know from using it personally and this communicating with quite a few people who are using ketone salt products, are sending me their blood work, telling me their benefits, whether it be seizures, performance, in the field, diving, being in hypoxia, climbing, things like that. So people are already getting the benefits of it. So the introduction to this powerful ketone ester into the market, I think, really can bring about, as you're bringing a technology to people that has wide-ranging implications for human health, potentially disease, and also human performance. So that's really interesting to me. And as a scientist, I am really excited to do more research. Most of what we have done have been in animal models, and I'm really excited to move our research more into human clinical trials and human performance trials. So maybe a commercially available supplement will allow us to
Unlock
do that,
and
expedite that process. So.
Very cool. And then last question here, as we're looking into the future, I think we touched upon this before, but I think it might just be helpful. So as we're moving into the future, what aspects of the manipulation of ketone metabolism do you think would be most promising as we look into the future of the research?
In regards to how the ketones can be used into that? I think there's a lot of potential benefits for the average everyday person, right? For me specifically, I mean, maybe speaking selfishly, I do intermittent fasting maybe a couple times a week.
Okay.
And
How long are your fasts?
I do about anywhere between 16 to 18 to maybe 20 hours on some days if I'm in the office.
Okay.
And I found tremendous benefits from just doing that maybe twice a week. I mean, sometimes I do it 3 or 4 times a week, or sometimes just once a week. But to also, I do the practice where it's maybe a modified intermittent, where I take ketones during that part of the day to maybe further augment my metabolism and give me energy in a way. But if you were to check my blood work, it would look like I'm further enhancing and shifting some of the biomarkers we know that are responsible for us getting benefits from therapeutic fasting.
Right.
So I'm pushing down insulin farther and even spiking ketones up a little bit more.
Right.
So I like to use it in that way, and I think what's very interesting is that we don't yet know the optimal way to use ketones. It will really be individualized and personalized. And the stay-at-home mom may have a different application than the guy who rides, cycles with his buddies after work or something like that.
Or Navy SEALs.
Or a Navy SEAL.
Or an NFL football player.
Exactly. Right. And I do think as creatine, when creatine came about, everyone was kind of skeptical. I remember in 1990, 1991, reading pamphlets about this when I was in high school. And now we know, after dozens if not hundreds of studies, that creatine, it's an alternative energy substrate that significantly enhances muscle energy capacity by enhancing ATP production. So, and I mean, it actually is probably one of the most effective supplements out there. So I see ketones filling that kind of situation where it allows cells to enhances the bioenergetic capacity of cells and allows them to make more ATP, but it's more versatile and it can be used, it's generating mitochondrial ATP production, it's enhancing that process. So I see it as kind of the next creatine, but with broader ranging implications that could be even incorporated into food supply.
The one I think about is like a fourth macronutrient, right?
Yes. So I was going there. Yeah. So actually, it's something that could be incorporated into the food supply as a metabolite that has been shown to impact gene expression of enzymes and mechanisms we know could confer longevity effects, hitting signaling pathways that have anti-inflammatory effects. It's a calorie-containing substance, which has beneficial effects on energy metabolism and many signaling processes. So that's pretty exciting to me. And I think I'm also interested in many different, whole food sources. I think consuming ketones, the ketone ester produces bioidentical ketone metabolites that we've had for many different years and enabled us to survive famine, survive starvation, and it's kind of reactivating a metabolic or genetic program that we've largely silenced through the advent of modern conveniences, modern food, and meal frequency.
Carbs all the time.
So we're bringing that out again, and I think by understanding nutrition, ketogenic nutrition, and with supplementation, we can get those benefits.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to stop by. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah.